It looks like we're recording this session. Very nice. All right, so today our topic is business agility, pivot or perish. So our agenda today is I'm first going to talk about the need for business agility. I'll define the terms. We'll go through some of the core concepts, and we'll end with some many closing remarks and open Q&A. Let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Richard Chang. I'm an agile trainer and coach by background. I'm here in the DC area. I'm zooming in from Reston, Virginia. In fact, if you want, in the chat window, type in where you are zooming in from. I'm in Reston, VA, right outside DC. That's where we're based out of. Next Up Solutions, based in the DC area. Blacksburg, Virginia. Welcome, Will, from Blacksburg. Go Hokies. Let's see, I'm a member of the local and national Agile, Scrum, and PMI organizations. I have a series of certifications, none of which are really relevant for this talk. And a lot of my background is in commercial, nonprofit, as well as government work as well. And the concepts we'll talk about today really do apply whether you're in the commercial world, whether you're a nonprofit or an association, or even in the government space. A lot of these concepts we'll talk about today still apply. And my fun fact was that I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before the pandemic, and hopefully I'm going to get in there before too long again. That's been about me. Here is my contact info. I'm going to copy and paste this into the chat window, so you guys all have my contact info. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Join us also Next Up Solutions on LinkedIn and Twitter. It looks like we have people from all over. Awesome. Chicago. That's great. From the UK. That's great too. Ukraine. Welcome. I think Ole so far wins a prize for furthest away. Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Very nice. Maryland, Winchester. Awesome. Let's see. This presentation is being recorded, and you'll get an email after class with information on the presentation and the recording as well. All right, let's talk about business agility. Let's first talk about the need for business agility. Here are two companies, Kodak and Fujifilm, both in similar space, both have a similar history. Kodak, in its prime, over 100,000 employees, over $1 billion in cash reserves, over $1 billion in intellectual property and patents. And ironically enough, Kodak invented the digital camera. Right now, cut to many years later, the Kodak today is a shell of what it once was. They're still around. They've filed bankruptcy several times now. They have less than 5,000 employees. At this point, they sold off most of their patents and intellectual property. So while they still are around today, it's not the Kodak that it once was. Right? Conditions change. Let's look at Fujifilm. Fujifilm was in a similar spot, but Fujifilm had some pivots. Now, one of the pivots they did end up becoming one of their most lucrative lines of business. Anyone know that one of the lines of business Fujifilm's pivoted to that now ends up being one of their most lucrative lines of business? Anyone have a guess? I'll give you a hint. What happened was Fujifilm, they had all the raw materials they use for processing film, and they realized that all the raw materials we use for processing film are essentially the exact same raw materials that's used in another industry. So Fujifilm's dipped their toes in the other industry, and it ended up being wildly successful. Anyone know what that industry is? Anyone have a guess? And this is one of these deals, if you don't know it, it's going to be really hard to stumble across. But what Fujifilms did is they dipped their toes and pivoted into cosmetics. What they realized was all the raw materials we use for film processing essentially align really well with the raw materials we use in cosmetics. Lift, it's not very well known in the US, but it's very popular in Asia, ends up now being one of their most profitable lines of business, right? Because of the pivot. Marriott for many years had the most listings on the internet for rental property. Here's the latest chart. It's no longer Marriott, it's Airbnb, and Airbnb now has more than the next 5 brands combined, right? Out of nowhere. March of 2020, right? This is my home right here. This is what I'm training out of. So March of 2020, essentially everyone had to pivot, right? We had the pandemic hit about a year and a half ago. And everyone overnight has to change business, working from home, changing how their teams work together. right? It really showed the need for our business agility. Some companies pivoted very well in this new world. Some struggled. Right? Here's a quote. I was at a business agility conference years ago, not that long ago, a few years ago, and one of the keynote speakers there, Mike Beadle, had a quote. When someone says they have 30 years of business experience, the danger is that they're still doing business like we did 30 years ago, right? And so what happens today is the world is just, things are faster, things change quicker. And if we can't pivot, right, that causes problems for us, right? And so one of the hottest concepts in the industry right now kind of reflects that, which is business agility. So let me first define business agility. This is the definition from the Agile Business Consortium. Business agility is the ability of an organization to adapt quickly to market changes, both internally and externally, to respond effectively to our customer demands, right? To adapt and lead change in terms of the way we put out our products, and to continuously be at a competitive advantage, right? These are some of the concepts we have in business agility. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the key enablers to business agility. And I kind of created these these are some of the elements we're talking about today. And I've kind of put together a bit of a rough model to kind of highlight this. And so what we have is we have a product strategy, which helps us build the right thing. So some of the concepts we'll talk about today that help us with product strategy will be ideas like design thinking and lean startup. Those are some sample examples. We'll talk about those today. There's some things that help us kind of build it well, right? That's the DevOps, the automation. And then there's practices we have that align our strategy with execution, which includes concepts such as Agile, such as Scrum, right? And all this we wrap around kind of our organization's ability to support this, which is the organizational alignment part. So in this talk today, we'll talk through some of these bullet points. Now, before I start, any questions so far? Right. I do see in the chat window, we will be recording this and we'll be sending out the recordings in the post-class email. Any other questions before we start? What I'm going to do now then is I'm going to start with a video. So we're going to talk about design thinking and we're going to start this off with a video. Now, I assume everyone here speaks Korean. Is that correct? Everyone here fluent in Korean? Well, I hope so because the video is in Korean. So let's go ahead and play this video. One moment, please. Oops, give me 1 second. I'm going to share the video. Here we go.
사람 중심으로 함께 혁신하는 것은 어떤 모습이며 기존의 방식과 어떻게 다를까요? 우선 기존의 많은 조직들이 일하는 방식을 한번 보시겠습니다. 기획자, 디자이너, 엔지니어가 훌륭한 제품을 만들기 위해 열심히 일을 하고 있습니다. 기획자가 열심히 기획을 하고, 디자이너가 열심히 디자인을 하고, 엔지니어가 열심히 개발을 합니다. 3개월 동안 열심히 제품을 만들어 사장님께 제품을 보여줍니다. 사장님이 마음에 드시지 않나 보군요. 이건 이렇게 만드는 게 낫지 않아? 다시 3개월 동안 사장님의 의견을 반영해 열심히 제품을 만듭니다. 기획자가 열심히 기획을 하고, 디자이너가 열심히 디자인을 하고, 엔지니어가 열심히 개발을 합니다. 3개월 후 다시 사장님에게 제품을 보여줍니다. 아주 만족스럽군요. 그럼 이제 제품을 시장에 출시해 볼까요? 6개월의 혼신과 열정이 담긴 제품을 사용자에게 보여줍니다. 그런데 고객이 마음에 들지 않나 보네요. 제게 필요한 건 이런 제품이 아니라고요. 6개월 동안 열심히 만든 제품이 필요가 없다니 참으로 슬픈 일이군요. 여기서 잠깐! 보통 이런 문제는 잘못된 문제 정의에서 비롯되는 경우가 많습니다. 그렇다면 올바른 문제 정의를 위해서는 어떤 방식으로 일해야 할까요? 우선 기획자, 디자이너, 엔지니어가 각자의 일에만 집중하는 것이 아니라 한자리에 모여 수평적인 커뮤니케이션을 할 수 있어야 합니다. 그뿐만이 아니죠. 가장 중요한 것은 사용자에 대한 공감을 통해 사용자가 필요로 하는 해결책을 제시하는 것입니다. 프로젝트의 초기부터 사용자를 면밀히 관찰하고 사용자 입장에서 제품을 만들어 가야 합니다. 사용자가 만족할 때까지 아이디어를 내고 프로토타입을 만들고 사용자와 함께 테스트하며 완성도를 높여갑니다. 사용자가 만족할 때까지 아이디어를 내고 프로토타입을 만들고 사용자와 함께 테스트하며 완성도를 높여갑니다. 사용자가 만족할 때까지 아이디어를 내고 프로토타입을 만들고 사용자와 함께 테스트하며 완성도를 높여갑니다. 우리는 이런 업무 방식을 사람 중심으로 함께하는 혁신이라고 말합니다.
So there we saw the video on design thinking. Let me share my slides again. So the concept here is very interesting, because what happens is when you talk about traditional project approach, what often happens is we start with the product, right? We build the product out and then we think, all right, who wants this product? What design thinking does, it starts with the users first. It understands who our users are, what are their needs, what are their goals, what are their pain points, how do they solve the problem without our product, what does our product do to help them solve their problems, right? That's kind of design thinking. We put the user first. In fact, the model looks more like this, where we first have to empathize with our users, understand who they are, what their needs are. Then we define these needs, right? Then we kind of ideate to understand, all right, how do we kind of address these needs and pain points and goals? We create some prototypes, some proof of concept, some way to validate this. We test what we put out. And then once the tests prove true, we can implement them. If they don't prove true, right, then we can identify what we do next with it, right? And so once again, this is a slightly different approach into traditional product management. And that traditional product management kind of doesn't, it starts here at the implement, right? And the stuff over here before it gets a bit potentially lost, right? So design thinking is a great approach. A bit of a plug, I teach an advanced product in our course, which I love that class. And we use this canvas here, which is the lean canvas, to work through those ideas. And what we do here is areas highlighted in green, I think are great because they really focus on that design thinking concept. I like this lean canvas a lot to help us to work through our product ideas. In this canvas, you have to think about your customer segments, who the early adopters are, what their problems are, how to address their problems, right? And that really kind of puts you in that front part of this picture. That's design thinking. Any questions about design thinking? Let's move to lean startup. Right now, with the lean startup, I will also start with a video here as well. So give me 1 second here while I bring up that video. I'm going to share the video. Here we go.
The Lean Startup: How Today's Entrepreneurs Use Continuous Innovation to Create Radically Successful Businesses, by Eric Ries, a serial entrepreneur who created the Lean Startup movement to help startups allocate their resources more effectively. Startups are not about coming up with a brilliant idea and becoming an overnight success, as many articles might have you believe. Entrepreneurship, in fact, is much more about testing and learning faster than your competitors. Most startups fail, but much of that failure is avoidable. And the Lean Startup is the methodology that helps entrepreneurs avoid failure. The reason why many startups fail is that they operate based on a conventional approach to management. Traditionally, doing your market research, coming up with a solid strategy, and delivering a great product works. But it doesn't work with startups, because it assumes that you already know what the market wants. And the moment you make that assumption, you're doomed to failure. You will waste too much time and money developing the perfect product before you realize that there's no market for it. The Lean Startup methodology is based on a rinse and repeat type of cycle. Build, measure, learn. Build a product, measure your customers' reactions, and learn if your idea has been validated or if you need to adapt. Repeat the cycle until your customers send you a clear signal that your product fits a market need, the much coveted product market fit. Before embarking on this journey, start by considering what are 2 or 3 key assumptions that you're making that will determine your startup success, and what is the cheapest and fastest way to test them. Once you've designed your test, build your minimum viable product, or MVP. That's not a product you'd be proud of, far from it. It just needs the critical features for your test to yield meaningful results. The singular role of the MVP is to play its part in your test. After you have an MVP, you need a good way to measure your customers' reactions. In order to avoid any biases after you've collected the data, it's best to come up with a baseline of metrics up front. If you're measuring conversions or email signups, how many do you need to consider the test a success? Be clear about what success and failure look like, because it's going to be much harder to distinguish between the two later. And finally, assess what you learned. Should you pivot or persevere? If your assumptions are confirmed, you're off to the races and you can focus on refining the product. But if one of your key assumptions is proven wrong, you may have to pivot, change your idea, or focus on a different customer segment and start the cycle over again. You may have to experiment more than you expected before you can find what your customers really want. Entrepreneurs often dive headfirst into an idea they're passionate about. Yet there's a more scientific approach to building a startup. Having a process to manage the chaos and uncertainties surrounding startups can be a lifesaver when you feel like you're struggling, swimming in the deep end.
That was a rookie move. I started talking, I was on mute. So that was a summary of the Lean Startup book by Eric Ries. I actually have the book right here, so it's a very nice book. But the concept here is great in terms of helping us manage our products. Let me share my PowerPoint. So what happens here in Lean Startup is that you create the vision, you identify your critical assumptions, right? Then what you want to do is these assumptions are assumptions. So what I want to be able to do is test my assumptions, right? Now, once I test my assumptions, if my assumptions prove to be correct, right, then I could, what the book calls, we could persevere and continue down that path. If my assumptions prove to be not what I expected, then we may need to pivot and try pivot kind of the product and try different things. In fact, I like this chart right here. When we talk about our assumptions in terms of our product assumptions, this Venn diagram breaks it into 3 key dimensions. Desirable, meaning do our users want it? Feasible, meaning can we build it? Viable, meaning should we build it? And obviously sweet spot is in the middle, right? Because what happens here is that this might be a product our users want, right? That our company wants us to build, but it involves technology that we don't have, right? That's where it's desirable, viable, but not feasible, right? Or it's something that we as a company want to put out that we can definitely build, but no one wants to buy. It's not desirable, right? Or it's something that we can build, people want to buy it, but it's not aligned with our company purpose and strategy, then it's not viable, right? And so these are some of a lot of the areas where our assumptions fall into, and what we want to really be is in that sweet spot. So these are things we can test out. Now, when we talk about this lean startup concept, it literally has the word lean and startup in it. And so some of what I've seen is a lot of large companies and a lot of my government clients might think, oh, it's not for us. But while it's called lean startup, at this point, these concepts we see applied across major organizations, companies such as GE, Procter & Gamble, Citi Ventures, Intuit, Toyota, NSA. These are all companies named by name in a article in Fortune magazine about 3 years ago, talking about the lean startup concepts. And so at this point now, it's something that it's not just for the startups, but it's really for us to kind of measure our assumptions and kind of validate our products before we make bigger investments into this, right? When we get to the end of this session, I'll show you another video that kind of wraps all that up. Now, what's interesting though, is this whole lean startup concept. There was a period there where the lean startup world and the agile world were kind of butting heads, because what happens from an agile standpoint, if those familiar with agile, is that working software is a primary measure of progress, right? Whereas lean startup says, whoa, let's not develop the product yet till we can validate some of our assumptions. And so from an agile standpoint, we want to start building the product right away. whereas a lean startup standpoint is we want to start learning about the product right away. But in recent years, we've done a really good job kind of marrying those two concepts. So here's a customer value curve where the y-axis shows the value to the customer and the x-axis shows our progression over time. So you'll notice initially first, there's kind of a bit of a slow roll at the very beginning. And so what happens here is we're getting learning, we're getting value, but it's a lot of the value getting early is knowledge focused. What I've seen called RAT, riskiest assumption testing. Here's where we validate some of our riskiest assumptions. Once we have those validated, we can quickly jump into delivering maximum value early. And then towards the end would be stuff that's lesser value that we have to decide if we even want to build out, right? So lean startup helps us align some of these concepts, especially in this early part of this, this flow. So ideas like lean startup, design thinking really help us with our product strategy to ensure we're building the right thing. Right? Now let's talk about aligning our strategy and execution with concepts like Agile and Scrum. So a lot of this might be repeat for some of you, so I won't spend too much time on this. But here is the Agile Manifesto. Right. In the chat window, give me a yes if you've seen this before. Give me a no if you have never seen this before. In the chat window, give me a yes if you've seen this before. Great. Right. It's new for a few of you, familiar to many of you. Here's what I want you to do. Take a moment to read this to yourself. Take a moment to read this to yourself. And as you read this, what I want you to think about is, do you have questions, thoughts, or concerns? Right. Read this to yourself, and as you read this, think about if while reading this, you come up with any questions, thoughts, or concerns. All right, I'll throw it out to the group. Any questions, thoughts, and concerns? Anyone read this and think to themselves, it's not that I don't like it, but this definitely brings up some questions, thoughts, or concerns. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns? Open question to the group. Either if so, say it out loud or put it in the chat. All right. Yeah, well, it looks like at this point, I think most people are good with it. Couple quick notes about this. I've heard people say stuff like, hey, we're doing Agile now, so we're not giving estimates anymore. We're doing Agile now, so we don't write documentation anymore. We're doing Agile now, so we don't have to worry about due dates anymore. That's not what Agile says, right? A lot of people think, hey, we ignore the things on the right, right? But that's not it. This last line is very important. We're not ignoring these things on the right. But what happened was back when this was written, 2001, what we had seen was that we had basically overcorrected on the right, right? And so the things on the right are things we do, but they're not the value in themselves. The things on the left here, what we've seen is when we have effective teams, organizations, and products, the pattern we see is that the teams and organizations have a focus and culture on the items on the left. Right. Let's see, there's a note here. Yeah, some of these may be challenging for larger companies to do, but remember, we're not ignoring these items, right? So the first one, we're not ignoring process and tools, but what we're saying though, is as an organization, we want to maximize our team's abilities to work together, right? We're not saying ignore the documentation, but the focus should be on delivery of the product. And for the documentation, I believe in this concept: minimum viable bureaucracy. What's the least amount I can do to responsibly meet the need? Because by definition, anything less is irresponsible, but by definition, anything more is excessive. One of the things I teach in my classes is when it comes to documentation, I ask two questions: who's it for, and how are they going to use it? And based on that answer, I'll focus something specifically for that. Quick example, especially in the government world, is in the government world, we have a documentation needs. And obviously you can't just tell OMB and GAO, you can't say, hey, we're Agile now, don't worry about us, we're good. It doesn't work that way, right? Same with large companies. But if I need documentation, for example, for the auditors, here's what I would do. I would meet with the auditors, identify what they need. Then what we would do is produce just a little bit less than I know they need. And then I would meet with the auditors again, and I would say, hey, auditors, here's what we have so far. It's not complete, but can we work together to fill in the gaps? Because that way you don't end up with a bunch of stuff that you can't use, and I don't end up writing a bunch of stuff that does you no good. Right? Focus on the product, minimal viable bureaucracy, just in time, just enough for the documentation. Customer collaboration, contract negotiation. Look, contracts are important, right? But at the end of the day, as a responsible implementer, I'm trying to build real solutions for solving real problems. And to do that, we have to collaborate with the right people to make it happen. We have to collaborate with the right people to make sure that what we build really solves real problems. Last one, following a change, responding to plan. There's a misconception in Agile, we don't have a plan. And we do. If you're using Scrum, what we'll see later, our plan, it looks like this at a high level, right? But what our plan needs to be able to do is respond to the day-to-day realities of our project. Right? So we're not ignoring these items on the right, it's the context of it. Right? Now, underneath the 12 principles, underneath the 4 key value points are the 12 principles. I don't have time in this session to go deep into it, but I will point this out. So when this thing was written in 2001, here was an early draft of it. And what you can see here is they actually kind of directed it, segmented it. So the first set of principles is slanted toward the customers. Deliver our product early and frequently, welcome changing requirements, deliver a product as frequently as possible, preferring a short time scale, and having business and developers work together daily. These are things slanted toward the customers. What the authors wrote here was slanted toward the managers. I would probably say slanted towards the organization. But here you have building projects around motivated individuals, giving them the environment to succeed, the working product as a primary measure of progress, and trying to create that sustainable pace. Those are slanted towards the organization. Slanted towards a team is continuous attention to technical excellence and good design. Right? Things like not doing all the testing at the end, but integrated testing throughout. Don't do all the architecture up front. Do enough for now and emerge architecture as you go. Simplicity, maximizing the amount of work not done. Don't do all your requirements at once. They're going to change. Understand your roadmap. Build enough for now with an eye towards tomorrow. Self-organizing teams. Don't tell teams what to do. Tell teams what they want. Let them storm around the solutions. Also passing decision-making down to a low level as responsibly possible. And then just at regular intervals, inspect and adapt and improve at regular intervals. These are the principles behind Agile. Right? So Agile, as some of you know, isn't a method. Agile is a mindset underneath which we have Agile methods like Scrum, like Kanban, like XP. Agile is a mindset. Scrum, Kanban, XP are the methods that we implement. And that's Agile. Any questions about Agile? Let's talk about Scrum. So, in the chat window, type in yes if you've worked in the Scrum framework before. Type in no if you have not worked in a Scrum framework before. Okay, great. So many of you are familiar with it. Some of you are newer to it, right? Now, here's a question. Type in yes if you worked in Waterfall before. Type in no if you have not. I like some of you put a little caveat in there too. Yeah, so Waterfall is perfectly valid. It's not an awful method, but it is awful at certain things. This is Dr. Winston Royce in 1970 wrote our first white paper about Waterfall. Dr. Royce didn't invent Waterfall, but he's one of our first documents we can find that really kind of highlight the concept. And even Dr. Royce says that the implementation is risky. It's not a bad model, but it's bad at change. So what happens is, as I go through these big phases, if we have change, especially change in a prior phase, it's very expensive, right? Scrum takes a vastly different approach out of it. Scrum focuses more, if you look at this Scrum big picture here, one of the biggest differences between Scrum and Waterfall and traditional project management is traditional project management has a heavy focus on WBS. Anyone know what WBS stands for? Who are my PMPs in the room? What's a WBS? In the chat window, someone type in what a WBS is. What is there you go. Yeah, work breakdown structure. So traditional project management has a strong focus on work breakdown structure, right? So if you look at this picture here, this is work breakdown structure at Waterfall. Get the requirements, do design, do development, test, and deploy, right? From a Scrum standpoint, it's not a work breakdown structure, it's an FBS. FBS, F as in Frank. Anyone have a guess what the F stands for in FBS? Anyone know what the F stands for in FBS? Ah, good. Yes. No, it's not fail. It's not fail. That is a hopefully a humorous answer, but it is a function or feature breakdown structure. So Scrum is a functional feature breakdown structure. So the example I like to use, if you're building Microsoft Word using Scrum, which I think they do, Microsoft has I live here in Reston, Virginia, and Microsoft has an office about 2 miles down from my house. I taught a class there once, and it was a Microsoft Office team in the class. So I think they use Scrum for building out Office. But if I use Scrum to build out, let's say, Microsoft Word, here's the way it worked. It's a feature breakdown structure. So all the stuff initially would be the most impactful, highest priority features. Open, type, save, edit, print. After that, the next most important, spell check, font formatting. After that, next most important, inserting tables, inserting images, right? So then later will be stuff that, it's not that it's not important, it's not as important. Track changes. I like that, that's a good feature. Subscript, superscript, those are important, not as important as mail merge, but important. And after that would be lesser important features. Mail merge, I don't use mail merge, but other people might. And then towards the end would be stuff that's lesser value. It's not that they're not valuable, it's lesser value. Things like wingdings, not a real language. Double strike through. Why do I need 2 strike through when I already have 1? Clippy. Remember Clippy? Paperclip assistant would pop up, wink at you, give you help. Nobody liked Clippy. Put Clippy at the end. Right. So Scrum focuses on iterative incremental framework. And so you're building capabilities as you go. And the great thing about that is if I run out of time, partway through, I'll have the most important features built out. Right. And at an execution level, here's what Scrum looks like. Here in this picture, all the triangles represent my roles, 1, 3, and 6. The artifacts are the circles, 2, 5, and 10. The events and activities are the squares. I'm going to walk you through this very quickly. Here we have the product owner. They bring in the needs of the end users, the customers, and the stakeholders. Number 2, type in the answer in the chat window if you know it. Number 2 is the artifact that stores all of our needs. Number 2 is the artifact that stores all of our needs. It's the product backlog. Product backlog stores all the needs, wants for the product. It can change over time, should change over time, but it's everything we know as of today. Ontholio, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anthoniel, product backlog items, awesome. That's what PBI stands for, is indeed product backlog items. In some of your environments, you may hear referred to as stories or user stories. Scrum calls these product backlog items. Number 3 is the role in Scrum responsible for delivering the solutions and building solutions. Type the answer in a chat window if you know it. Number 3 is the Scrum development team. Although interestingly enough, it has now been with the recent 2020 update of the Scrum Guide, November 2020, they're now called developers, but it's all the team members working together to develop solutions. So not just coders, it could be coders, analysts, testers, and for non-IT teams, like I used to work at the labor union, SEIU, my teams are fundraising teams and political teams, and my team members are either activists or analysts, but they're still all called developers. Number 4, what is the first meeting we have to kick off the sprint in Scrum? Sprint planning. Sprint planning is correct. Sprint planning, we talk about what's the goal of the sprint, how much we can achieve, and we break it down to smaller tasks. Oh, I see a note here from Ole, where there's no Scrum team, dev team in the Scrum Guide 2020. Yeah, so it's a good point. Basically what happened in the Scrum Guide is they relabeled the dev team as developers. They basically relabeled the dev team as developers. Good point, Ole. So sprint planning is where identify basically our plan for the sprint. So then number 5 represents the team's plan for the sprint. What is number 5? What is the team's plan for the sprint? Very good, Tony. Sprint backlog is correct. Sprint backlog is owned by the team. It contains the sprint goal, the items in the sprint, and the items in the sprint broken down to smaller tasks, right? Every sprint should have a sprint goal. The goal of the sprint isn't to just finish everything. The goal of the sprint is by the end of the sprint, what is it that we would have really affected? What is it we really have moved? That's the sprint goal. The sprint goal, the items in the sprint, and the tasks for the sprint are all encompassed in the sprint backlog. Coming, number 6, the role in Scrum responsible for ensuring that we're working effectively as a team, helping us remove impediments and ensure that we have an environment of continuous improvement. What is number 6? Very nice. Good answers in the chat. Scrum Master is right. As we get into our sprint, notice it says 1 to 4 weeks. In the chat window, type in how long your sprints are. In the chat window on your team, for those doing Scrum, type in how long your sprints are. 3 weeks, 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Okay, great. So here's my thought is the shorter you can make it, the more feedback points you have, right? And so my preference is shorter over longer. Now, with that said, 1 week sprints are great if you can do them, but I will admit that 1 week sprints are very challenging for newer teams. just the ability to absorb the overhead of the planning, refinement, daily scrum, review, and retro in 1 week cycles can be challenging for newer teams. 2 week sprints I like a lot. That's usually what I do with my teams. 3 week sprints gets to be a little bit long by today's standards, but it's still, within that tolerance. 4 week sprints are really good. I use 4 week sprints a lot when I'm doing stuff outside of IT, like if there's hardware involved, or for like when I was at the labor union, when we were doing political campaigns and fundraising campaigns, we did month-long sprints. But if I'm doing digital IT, I find that in general, 4 week sprints get to be a bit long, and I like to try to make it a bit shorter. Yeah, but that's the guidance, anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. Once we get into our sprint, number 7 is the event that happens daily that allows our team to sync up for the day. What's number 7? Daily Scrum is correct. Discovery sprints are not a thing in Scrum. You're free to do them, but they're not a thing. They're just a sprint like any other sprint. If you want to do them, you can, but discovery sprints aren't an official Scrum term. But if you want to do them, you're free to. Yeah. Number 8 is the event. It's the Daily Scrum is the event that happens daily. It allows our team sync up for the day and see how they're progressing towards the sprint goal. Right. Number 8 is real-time active requirements management. What is number 8? Real-time active requirements management. We add new requirements, remove things that are stale or dated, reprioritize, split things up that are too big. This is product backlog refinement. Product backlog refinement. Sometimes you hear referred to as grooming, but this is the real-time active requirements management. One of the biggest differences between Scrum and Waterfall. Waterfall, you build all requirements at once. Scrum, you have just enough for now, and then we're constantly refining and tuning it as we go. Coming out of the sprint, number 9, we invite our end users, customer stakeholders in to give us feedback on what we built so far. What is number 9? Yeah, sprint review. Demo was good too. Yeah, I've heard referred to as demo. Scrum calls it sprint review. We've heard referred to as demo as well. That's where we get feed. The sprint review is where we inspect and adapt the product. Number 10 is what's being delivered at the end of every sprint. What is number 10? Oh yeah, by the way, Ola is correct. PBR is not a Scrum event, it's an activity. So that's why I label this events/activities. The product backlog refinement is not a Scrum event, it's an activity. Yeah. Number 10 is indeed the increment. Number 10 is the increment. The increment's delivered at the end of every sprint. It's a sliver of capability, is our increment. Very nice, good answers. What is number 11? Number 11, oh, good answer. I didn't even have to give you a hint, Cindy. Cindy knew right away. Process of elimination. Scrum inherently cheats. If we don't like something in Scrum, fix it. Retrospective allows us to inspect and adapt the way we work together. Quick note, by the way, a lot of you might have alternative words in some of these areas. Like instead of sprints, I hear the word iterations, probably means the same thing. Instead of refinement, I hear the word grooming, probably means the same thing. Instead of Scrum, instead of daily Scrum, I hear the word daily stand-up. Instead of sprint review, I hear demo. Instead of PBI, I sometimes hear user stories, which technically is a format for writing PBIs. I don't care what you call it in your environments, but just know that the Scrum guide uses these terms here. Yeah. Yeah, stand-ups we hear very often. Yeah, it's very common. Yeah, and I hear people use those terms interchangeably. Any Scrum questions? All right, let's get into the execution side of it. This is building it well. So let's first talk about DevOps. So DevOps, basically the concept with DevOps is we take this whole cycle where we're gonna basically plan it out, code it, build it, test it, release it, deploy it, operate it, monitor it, to have it feed back into our plans to code, build, test, release. And what we have here is from a DevOps standpoint, it stands for development and operations. It's where the same team owns the entire pipeline end to end. It's a great concept. And the more we can mature it, the more we can kind of effectively mature and optimize our release cycles, right? And from a release standpoint, my guidance is to release as often as possible based on your current constraints and based on your user's current abilities to absorb your releases. And then over time, try to make those even faster as well. In fact, here's a great example. I Googled this one day. How often does Amazon deploy to production? What Google told me was once every 11.7 seconds. Now, obviously it's Amazon, so they own their own clouds, and I'm imagining it's more than one team, and they probably have bots that do fixing like Netflix does as well. But it's still a very kind of extreme or a very advanced example of very mature DevOps capabilities. Right? Now, what goes really hand in hand with DevOps and kind of execution is automation. So let's first talk about continuous integration. So here's the concept. I'm a developer, right? Or we have developer one made a change. We check the change into version control. It gets checked into the build server. The build server then automatically kicks off our build, which compiles it, compiles our code, runs unit tests, integration tests, packages up for deployment, runs deployment, does the acceptance testing, some static code analysis. Everything was great. Green light. Developer two, which is me, I made a change. I check in version control. It runs the build. We compile the change, do the unit test, but then I broke the build. An email gets sent out. Rich broke the build again. Everyone looks at me and I hang my head in shame as I fix my code. What continuous integration does, it allows us to automate our quality patterns and do it automatically, either regularly scheduled, which a lot of teams do, or gated check-ins, which teams do as well. I think both are great. Both have their uses on teams. This helps us better manage our quality. The other place where I think automation is critical is in testing. One of the most expensive parts of change is the testing of the change. This is the testing quadrants as aligned by Brian Merrick. And so what we have here is 4 different quadrants of testing. So on this up and down axis, the y-axis, it's business facing at the top and more technology facing at the bottom. This x-axis here is our testing of it. Here we're going to be testing more of the product. Here testing more of the programming, right? And so what happens here is in these 4 quadrants, 3 of these quadrants should be automated. So here where we have at the bottom left, do the unit test, the component test, the system test, those we should automate. And typically it's software developers. Typically it's up to the software developers to automate this part of it. The performance testing, security testing, in most organizations, that's already automated. You know, you really don't have organizations hiring at 5,000 people to do performance testing all at once. Performance testing, security testing are typically automated, and typically they're owned by many organizations. Like security testing would be owned by the security group. Performance testing might be owned by like a network operations group. But these, most companies are already automated usually. Now the functional acceptance testing, this is ones that I don't see automated as often, but we have all the tools to automate this. Tools like Selenium and Fitness, Cucumber, Gherkin, are all things we can, tools and practices, tools we can use to help with the automation. And this part here should be automated as well. What that means is manual testing still has a place, but these 3 quadrants here are a lot of kind of repeated test patterns that we can automate. So the manual testing, I recommend for stuff like usability testing, exploratory testing, kind of just spot checks and showcases, that I would do for the manual. The other 3 I would automate, right? By doing that, what we can do is become more effective in our execution practice, building it well. Finally, the last thing I want to say here is organizational alignment. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that because I actually have a good buddy of mine. One of my best friends wrote a book. So my buddy Kareem Harbit wrote a book. I have it here. It's now available as of now on Amazon. It just got published about a month or 2 ago. Now his book, he calls it 6 Enablers of Business Agility. All of his enablers talk about organizational alignment. So we're talking about leadership management, the culture, the structure, the people and their engagement, the governance and funding, and the ways of working. So his is focused all around the organizational alignment, right? And so I recommend his book highly. I think there's a lot of goodness to it, and we'll go with that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to conclude this part of it with a video, one last video to kind of bring this together. I'm going to share the video.
What are the greatest minimum viable products of all time? I've absolutely no idea, but here are 3 of my favorites. Hi, this is Gary. Welcome to Development That Pays. Today we're going to take a look at 3 of my favorite examples of minimum viable products. Before diving in, let's establish some ground rules for a proper MVP. It's got to be minimal, it's got to be viable, and it's got to be actually no, it doesn't have to be a product. I'll be showing you a great example of a non-product in a minute or 2. It has been argued that the word product in MVP is unhelpful. Steve Cohen has made a strong case for using the word experiment instead, and I have to say I agree. But for now, let's stick with the P and temporarily redefine it to premeditated. meaning that the MVP must be a deliberate attempt to learn about the market. This rules out cases that look like MVPs in retrospect, but were really full products that just happened, to everyone's surprise, develop into something big. Let's get going, starting at number 3. It's Buffer. Buffer is an application that makes it easy to share content on social media. Way back in the beginning, they put these 2 pages on their website. It's a test, certainly, but at this point, not quite an MVP. The next version was better. They slotted this page in between the other 2 pages. Now visitors to the website are not just saying, this is interesting, they're saying, I want to buy this. In fact, there was nowhere for anyone to input credit card details or payment details of any kind, but anyone who got this far was at least prepared to think about parting with their money. As co-founder Joel Gascoigne said, after this result, I didn't hesitate to start building the first minimal version of the real functioning product. Minimal, yep. Viable, yep. Premeditated, yes, definitely. This was definitely an experiment. Buffer has gone on from this MVP to do really quite well. Its current valuation is something close to $400 million. Moving on to number 2, it's Dropbox. Dropbox, as I'm sure you know, is a file synchronization service. Edit a file on your desktop, and seconds later, it's updated on all of your other devices. Rewind to the very early days of Dropbox. The team, entirely composed of techie types, had the basic synchronization working. That was the easy bit. The hard bit was going to be to achieve the same trick on every platform: Mac, Windows, Android, iPhone, etc., etc. Given that the team was all technical types, you'd have put your money on them diving straight in. Drew Houston, the CEO, did something surprising. He made a video. The video, just 3 minutes long, demonstrated the sync process end to end. But it was more than just a simple demo. It was full of techie in-jokes designed to appeal to early adopters.
Where you'll see that not only are the changes from my Mac already here, but if I make...
And it worked like a charm. In Drew's words, it drove hundreds of thousands of people to the website. Our beta waiting list went from 5,000 people to 75,000 people literally overnight. It totally blew us away. Minimal, yes. Viable. Well, there wasn't a product that could be used, but there certainly was a product that could be demonstrated. Premeditated? Yep, definitely an experiment. Dropbox also went on to do quite well. Its current valuation stands somewhere between $5 and $10 billion. It's time for my number 1 pick. It's Zappos. It's 1999. Co-founder Nick Swinmurn, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, wanted to build an online store for shoes. But would people use it? Here's how he went about finding out. He popped down to his local shoe stores. He went into each of the stores and I shit you not, he photographed pairs of shoes. The photographs were uploaded to a super simple website. If someone clicked on a button to buy a pair, Nick could pop down to the store where he took the photo and buy the shoes. What I love about this one is that behind the scenes, there's pretty well zero infrastructure, almost zero inventory, and yet from the customer's point of view, everything appears to be perfectly in place. Minimal, definitely. Viable? Well, this time it's not even up for discussion. Definitely viable. Real customers, real money changing hands, real shoes being shipped. Premeditated? Yes, of course. Zappos went on to do quite well. They were acquired by Amazon in 2009 for a cool $1.2 billion. Buffer, Dropbox, and Zappos, 3 of my favorite MVPs. What do you think of my choices? Any you disagree with? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd also like to hear about your favorites. Let me know in the comments and I'll feature the best ones in a future episode. Thank you very much for watching and I look forward to talking to you next time.
All right. So there we saw a very cool video where they, what they highlight there is a kind of a point we made a bit earlier. And that when you look at this kind of agile curve, or this value curve, right? At the very beginning, right? What they did there is they did some things that really test out the knowledge, but in a very effective way while building out the product. Yeah. It's a great example of, kind of rethinking our approach to MVP. So in conclusion, a few notes around is that same keynote Mike Beadle gave that I mentioned earlier at the start of this talk. At the end of his talk, he said something along the lines of this: as I look around this room, I see some dinosaurs. Some of you, are going to go extinct. maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the way your businesses work today, you're just not going to survive these conditions today, right? And he said it's fine because some of you have to go extinct for others to flourish. But what we want to be able to identify is if you can't rapidly adjust to the business, I'm sorry, what we want to be able to understand is if we can't rapidly adjust to our business needs, right? We could be, the danger is we're that dinosaur. Now, some recommended readings. So on top of Kareem's book, which is great, I recommend that. A few other books I think are really good are Stephen Denning's The Leader's Guide to Radical Management, as well as the Phoenix Project puts a lot of these concepts, kind of gives you good anecdotes and examples of these concepts. Kareem's book as well. Also, come to our training. I highly recommend our training course to learn more about Agile and Scrum concepts in general. And once again, here is my contact information. Copy and paste this in the chat once again. Now, with that said, as we close, I want you to think about the session and think about one question you have coming out of the session or one key takeaway you have coming out of the session. So think about what we just talked about. Think about one question you have coming out of the session or one key takeaway you have coming out of the session. Now, as you think about that, if anyone wants to share their question or takeaway, feel free to do so. Any questions or comments as we close out? All right, barring any questions or comments, I want to thank everyone for their attention today. Anna, do you have any closing announcements you want to make before we end the session?
No closing announcements for me. Thank you, though.
Tim, I'm not sure you're a dinosaur. I'm sure you can pivot quickly from being a dinosaur to a unicorn. But that is the danger, though. The danger is that, as a business, if we can't rapidly adjust to changing conditions, the danger is that we're the dinosaur. And that's the danger, in my hometown of, my home state of Virginia, right down in Richmond, right? The Circuit City down there was one of the biggest employers in the area. And I had friends that worked there. And, companies like that, when they go away, that's it. That didn't come back. And that was at the time, that was a big presence in Richmond, Virginia. And so, that's very sad when that happens. I'm sad the whole Toys R Us thing went away. I heard rumors it might be coming back, but we had a lot of good family time there. And so Radio Shack as well. I remember as a nerd growing up, we spent a lot of time in Radio Shack and doing Boy Scouts, we spent a lot of time in Radio Shack. So it's what we want to be able to do is, there are companies like Netflix. Remember Netflix and Blockbuster for a while there were in the exact same business. DVDs through the mail, right? One of them right now is a thriving billion-dollar company. The other's Blockbuster, right? And so what happens now is the ability to pivot really identifies what our company is and becomes going forward. All right. With that said, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. Everyone enjoy the rest of your Friday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks, everybody.